Have you ever wondered what would happen if a being who sees time not as a line, but as an entire tapestry, suddenly appeared in the grim, war-torn universe of Warhammer 40K? Imagine the calm, calculating presence of Dr. Manhattan descending upon a galaxy steeped in endless war, where empires rise and fall under the weight of unending conflict, and where gods and monsters dictate the fate of billions. What would such a being do when faced with the Imperium of man, the forces of chaos, and alien civilizations bent on annihilation? Stick with us till the end, and you'll witness a story where the very fabric of the 41st millennium is challenged, twisted, and redefined in ways no one could anticipate. Dr. Manhattan's arrival was not heralded by trumpets or cosmic omens. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, until entire planetary systems felt a shift in the air, a distortion in reality itself. On a remote industrial world in the segmentum obscurus, Imperial forces first noticed a subtle anomaly: matter behaving contrary to expectation, time seeming to stretch and compress at random intervals. Reports flooded the administratum, soldiers disappearing and reappearing, the sudden collapse of hostile forces without trace of conventional weaponry, and the inexplicable regeneration of entire battlefields overnight. It was the work of a mind that saw no beginning or end, only the inevitability of every moment simultaneously. The Imperium, accustomed to threats both mundane and cosmic, was at a loss. Space Marine chapters mobilized, inquisitors convened, and the Adeptus Mechanicus recalibrated their most sensitive instruments. Yet no explanation sufficed. The Emperor of Mankind, ever watchful from Terra, observed this anomaly with rare concern, not because the being posed immediate danger, but because nothing in the known universe, neither chaos, nor Xenos, nor traitorous ambition, had ever displayed a pattern so alien, so fundamentally untouchable. Dr. Manhattan's presence was a paradox, his power absolute, yet his motives inscrutable. Chaos forces sensed the disturbance almost instinctively. Demons recoiled and whispered of a presence that dwarfed their own influence, while champions like Abaddon the Despoiler paused, momentarily unsettled by the indifference of an entity that operated beyond ambition or desire. For Dr. Manhattan, these conflicts were almost quaint, trivial echoes of a war he had observed countless times from his own timeline. And yet, his attention lingered not out of allegiance, but curiosity. A galaxy in constant turmoil, billions of lives hanging by threads of violence and faith, all compressed into a living experiment of cause and effect. As this story unfolds, you'll see how Dr. Manhattan's quiet observations escalate into interventions that reshape the battlefield, challenge the most powerful beings in existence, and force the Imperium, and even chaos itself, to confront forces they cannot comprehend. By the end of this journey, the very concept of fate, free will, and power in the 41st millennium will be questioned in ways no human or alien could anticipate. Stick with us, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about Warhammer 40K. What would you do if the most powerful being in the universe appeared on your doorstep, and your weapons, strategies, and entire understanding of reality were instantly meaningless? That was the question haunting the leaders of the Imperium as Dr. Manhattan's presence became undeniable. Reports of his interventions reached Terra in fragmented, baffling transmissions worlds where entire chaos incursions were undone overnight, fleets vanishing only to reappear intact in the heart of the enemy lines, and soldiers recounting impossible visions of events that had not yet occurred. The administratum struggled to categorize him. Was he a weapon, a god, or a force beyond comprehension? And perhaps most terrifyingly, did it even matter which? On Macragge, Robout Gilliman convened a council with his most trusted commanders. "We face something unlike anything before," he declared, his voice heavy with measured concern. "This is not a Xenos invasion, not a chaos plot. Our enemies themselves falter in its presence, yet it moves with neither loyalty nor malice, only observation. We must understand it or risk everything." Space Marines deployed across border sectors, observing Manhattan from a distance, documenting patterns of interference, but finding no conventional logic. No flamer, no bolter, no artillery strike could provoke a reaction. Dr. Manhattan did not act like a being constrained by battlefield objectives. He acted like a law of nature, inevitable, immutable, and utterly indifferent. The Inquisition scrambled to investigate. Inquisitor Vara, an astute but increasingly unnerved observer, convened a conclave of scholars, psychers, and astropathic experts. "We face an entity outside the natural order," she warned, "one that sees the entirety of time at once. Any attempt to control it with force is not only futile but dangerous. We must appeal to its logic, reason, or curiosity, or it will render our galaxy irrelevant." Yet even as they theorized, Dr. Manhattan continued to act. On a manufacturing world under siege by Ork warbands, entire squadrons of tanks and infantry vanished, only to reappear in formation atop enemy lines, dismantling them with surgical precision. No human hand directed this. No strategy had dictated it. It was the quiet, absolute execution of a mind unconstrained by the limitations of mortality. Meanwhile, the Emperor of Mankind observed all from the throne room on Terra. Even he, a being whose power and foresight rivaled any in the galaxy, found Dr. Manhattan a perplexing anomaly. "He is not like the warp, nor any material threat," the Emperor mused. "He is a force beyond comprehension. We cannot oppose him, for opposition presumes a goal or a desire, and yet his presence is changing the balance of power." Imperial advisors whispered, debated, and argued, but the Emperor's assessment remained clear. Understanding Manhattan was the only option, because outright confrontation was folly. As word spread across the galaxy, the Imperium's citizens, soldiers, and commanders alike began to question what they had always taken for granted. The strength of the Emperor, the inevitability of war, even the seeming permanence of chaos and Xenos threats, all were challenged by a being who moved through time as one moves through space. Dr. Manhattan's presence, silent yet omnipresent, had already begun reshaping strategies, allegiances, and the very understanding of power. In a galaxy where the strong rule the weak and death is certain, a being unconcerned with either introduced a question no one could answer: what truly mattered in the 41st millennium? And so the Imperium prepared not to fight, not to dominate, but to observe, learn, and adapt to a presence that would redefine the rules of existence itself. What happens when the most feared agents of chaos realize that even their dark gods might not hold dominion over reality itself? That was the unsettling realization that swept through the warp as Dr. Manhattan's presence became known. For millennia, the Chaos Space Marines and demonic legions had thrived on fear, manipulation, and the unchallenged sway of the Imperium. Yet this new arrival was different, silent, absolute, and utterly unconcerned with allegiance or devotion. Even the whispers of Tes, Inch, the changeling god, faltered, for no scheme could account for a being who could perceive all outcomes and manipulate the very fabric of causality at will. Abaddon the Despoiler, Lord of the Black Legion, felt a rare sense of unease. He had conquered worlds, shattered civilizations, and challenged the Imperium countless times, yet the arrival of Dr. Manhattan left him unsettled. No stratagem could predict Manhattan's moves. No demonic invocation could compel him. Abaddon attempted to rally his forces, summoning hordes of Chaos Space Marines and demons to confront this anomaly. They advanced with their usual savagery, bolters blazing and warp energy crackling. But what met them was not a battlefield in the conventional sense. Tanks froze mid-stride, demons recoiled from invisible forces, and entire squads of traitors vanished, only to find themselves deposited in the heart of their own lines with absolute precision. Chaos did not understand this. The entities they worshipped, the dark gods themselves, thrived on passion, greed, and ambition. Dr. Manhattan observed all these with detached curiosity, as if assessing a grand experiment rather than participating in the struggle. He moved through worlds with an almost disinterested grace, shifting entire planetary battlefields with the faintest flick of energy, dismantling threats without malice, without reason, and without warning. Where once chaos's influence could sway or corrupt, now it found itself impotent, exposed, and confounded. Even the most powerful sorcerers, seasoned in the arts of manipulation and summoning, could barely comprehend the mechanics of his presence. Amidst the turmoil, philosophical questions began to ripple through the minds of both mortal and immortal. If the most powerful beings in the universe were helpless before Dr. Manhattan, what did that mean for destiny, for free will, for the very concept of power? Inquisitor Vera recorded her observations with trembling awe, realizing that no doctrine, no litany, and no prophecy could adequately prepare humanity for this anomaly. The Imperium's strategies were obsolete not because they were flawed, but because the rules themselves had been rewritten. Dr. Manhattan did not fight, did not ally, and did not conquer. He simply observed and acted on a scale that mortals could barely comprehend. Even Abaddon's pride could not withstand the reality of his impotence. The Black Legion attempted to coerce, bribe, and assault, yet every attempt failed in ways that seemed almost deliberate. Dr. Manhattan's interventions were surgical, precise, and absolute. Entire fleets were neutralized without explosion, entire legions incapacitated without a blow, and entire timelines shifted subtly yet irrevocably. Chaos, which had survived countless millennia through cunning and brutality, faced a presence that did not play by any known rules. And so the galaxy trembled not because of war or conquest, but because the very foundations of power, fear, and inevitability were being challenged by an entity beyond ambition, beyond loyalty, beyond the very notion of good or evil. The Imperium and Chaos alike realized that this was not a battle they could win or lose. It was an observation they could only survive. And in that survival lay the dawning realization that the rules of the 41st millennium had changed forever. What would you do if an enemy so powerful appeared that victory or defeat no longer mattered, only survival? And even survival itself seemed irrelevant in its presence. That was the question hanging over the hive world of Erebos Prime, a sprawling industrial planet perpetually teetering on the brink of anarchy, as Dr. Manhattan arrived to observe and subtly act. Entire sectors of the planet were in flames, orc warbands rampaging through manufactorums, chaos cults igniting riots, and Imperial Guard regiments struggling to maintain order. It should have been a battle of attrition, a massacre measured in thousands, tens of thousands, and yet, as Manhattan arrived, the rules of engagement ceased to apply. In an instant, what should have been a chaotic battlefield became something unrecognizable. Entire orc mobs halted mid-charge, their weapons suspended in midair as if caught in an invisible force. Chaos cultists froze, their arcane chants cut off mid-syllable, and Imperial Guard soldiers blinked in shock as entire tanks lifted from the ground, repositioned, and deployed with surgical precision against enemies that hadn't yet realized the danger they were in. Manhattan's presence did not shout. It whispered through reality, bending probability and causality with the quiet inevitability of a tide that reshapes the coastline. No human, no alien, and no demon could resist. Space Marine detachments arrived, expecting to engage in brutal combat, only to discover that their actions no longer determined the outcome. Battle lines redrew themselves in fractions of a second. Entire waves of attackers rerouted or neutralized before they could strike. For the first time, the soldiers of the Imperium experienced awe without hope, fear without understanding. Even their most battle-hardened commanders, veterans of countless wars against Tyranids, Orks, and traitors, found themselves watching as if spectators to a demonstration of divine inevitability. Dr. Manhattan moved not to conquer, but to illustrate the fragility of everything mortals held sacred. The Orks, for all their rage and numbers, were no match for the quiet calculus of Manhattan's perception. Their machinery sputtered and exploded mid-operation, not from weapon fire, but from unseen manipulation, as if the very laws of physics were being selectively rewritten around them. Chaos demons screamed, yet found no purchase in the warp, their rituals unwound mid-chant, their energies dissipating into nothingness. Imperial Guard regiments, initially terrified, realized that survival now depended not on courage or tactics, but on adaptation to a force that operated above the level of conventional strategy. Even then, they could not predict what would come next. In the center of Erebos Prime, Dr. Manhattan paused. Time itself seemed to ripple around him. Factories rebuilt themselves, battlefields repaired in seconds, lives preserved in moments that had no natural place. To the soldiers and commanders witnessing it, it felt like watching a god at work, but one who neither demanded worship nor sought allegiance. Everything and nothing changed simultaneously, and the Imperium, Chaos, and Orks alike were forced to confront a fundamental truth. Their wars, their power struggles, and even their gods were now part of an experiment in causality far beyond their comprehension, and yet, despite the devastation, or perhaps because of it, there was a strange clarity. Manhattan's intervention, surgical and absolute, demonstrated the impermanence of all things in the 41st millennium, revealing that even the most entrenched conflicts could be undone, redirected, or reshaped by a mind unconstrained by the rules that mortals, gods, and demons had lived by for millennia. The hive world of Erebos Prime survived, but not as it had been. It existed now as proof that the universe could bend in ways no one could fully anticipate, and that true power lay not in ambition or might, but in the understanding of time, causality, and inevitability itself. Have you ever wondered what war looks like when the rules themselves bend and twist beneath your feet? That was the new reality of the galaxy as Dr. Manhattan expanded his influence beyond Erebos Prime, intervening in conflicts on a scale that no mortal commander, or even God, had ever imagined. Across the segmentum obscurus, planetary governors reported impossible phenomena, entire fleets disappearing from one system and reappearing light. Years away, Tyranid hive ships rerouted as if guided by an invisible hand, and chaos warbands immobilized mid-assault. Soldiers and commanders alike began to understand that the universe itself had become a weapon, wielded not by ambition or strategy, but by observation, calculation, and the quiet inevitability of being who existed outside time. Imperial strategists scrambled to comprehend these events. Robout Gilliman convened councils across multiple star systems, sending reports to Terra and consulting with the Adeptus Mechanicus on instruments that might measure or predict Manhattan's actions. Yet no tool could chart his movements, no psyker could trace his intent. Dr. Manhattan did not move in conventional space or time. He existed simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, manipulating events with a precision that made the most sophisticated imperial planning obsolete. Fleets that once clashed in grinding attrition now found battles resolved before they began, as though the chessboard had been reset by an unseen hand. Chaos, meanwhile, grew desperate. Abaddon the Despoiler, frustrated by repeated failures, escalated his assaults with fury bordering on obsession. Entire Chaos fleets, previously invincible, were rerouted, trapped, and dissolved without a single direct engagement. Sorcerers attempting to summon demonic legions found their spells undone almost immediately, as if the very fabric of reality refused to acknowledge their incantations. Even the warp itself seemed to resist corruption, trembling under the gaze of an entity whose perception encompassed all timelines at once. It was no longer a war of might, cunning, or devotion. It was a test of understanding, and the universe itself had chosen a new arbiter. Dr. Manhattan's interventions were not cruel, nor were they benevolent. They were impartial demonstrations of inevitability, reshaping conflict in ways both subtle and catastrophic. On a battlefield where a regiment of Imperial Guard faced annihilation by Tyranid swarms, entire battle lines were subtly shifted. Trench walls reformed, artillery repositioned, and tactical advantages appeared without explanation. Soldiers reported the strange sensation of being guided, protected by forces they could not see and did not understand. Even the most seasoned veterans of the Imperium found themselves questioning the meaning of courage, leadership, and survival in a galaxy where one being could alter outcomes without touching weapon. Philosophical questions rippled across every echelon of power. If a single mind could influence entire campaigns across light years, what then was the purpose of human agency? Did the Emperor's vision of the Imperium remain meaningful, or was it now merely a momentary illusion in a galaxy whose fate could be rewritten at will? Inquisitor Vera, chronicling these events for future generations, reflected on the terrifying and awe-inspiring implications. That power, as mortals understood it, had a limit beyond which it became irrelevant, and that Dr. Manhattan existed entirely beyond it. And so the galaxy continued to burn, yet burned differently than ever before. Conflicts unfolded, armies engaged, and worlds teetered on the edge of destruction, but always under the quiet, inescapable gaze of a being who saw all, knew all, and intervened not out of malice or loyalty, but simply because he could. The wars of the 41st millennium had entered a new phase, one where ambition and strategy mattered less than understanding, and where even the greatest powers in existence were forced to reckon with the fact that they were no longer masters of their own fate. What happens when the most powerful being in the universe comes face to face with the most powerful mortal in existence? That question echoed across Terra as Dr. Manhattan finally made his presence known to the Emperor of Mankind. The throne room, normally a bastion of awe-inspiring authority, became the stage for an encounter unlike any in the history of the Imperium. Here stood the Emperor, a godlike figure who had guided humanity for 10,000 years, confronting a being whose understanding of time, matter, and causality rendered even the Emperor's foresight almost trivial. The air itself seemed to quiver with anticipation, and the greatest minds of the Imperium watched, captivated and uncertain. Dr. Manhattan did not speak in the language of mortals, yet his presence communicated volumes. Time flowed around him differently. Moments of potential futures flickered across the floor, histories rewritten in fractions of a second, possibilities made manifest without effort. The Emperor, normally the arbiter of destiny itself, observed silently, weighing not just Manhattan's power, but his motives, or lack thereof. Was he an ally, an observer, or a force indifferent to the struggles of humanity? Even a being as omniscient as the Emperor could not claim to fully understand. Their confrontation was not one of weapons or armies, but of philosophy and cosmic perspective. The Emperor asked questions few mortals could articulate, about purpose, about morality, about the nature of power itself. Manhattan responded not with words, but with demonstrations. The collapse and restoration of entire planetary ecosystems, the freezing and acceleration of time across a battlefield, and the subtle reshaping of reality in ways that revealed the fragility of every assumption the Imperium had ever held. For the first time, the Emperor recognized that true power was not measured in armies or weapons, but in the ability to perceive, manipulate, and transcend the constraints of existence itself. Across the galaxy, commanders felt the ripple of this encounter. Even without direct engagement, Dr. Manhattan's presence influenced outcomes light years away. Chaos forces found their plans unraveling, Tyranid invasions delayed or redirected, and Ork warbands neutralized with surgical precision. The Imperium's armies adapted, not through conventional strategy, but by learning to anticipate the subtle shifts caused by a mind that operated outside conventional causality. Philosophical and practical consequences intertwined. Survival now depended on perception, understanding, and the ability to adapt to a universe where the rules themselves were being rewritten. Yet, for all the demonstrations of power, Manhattan remained detached, observing rather than acting in allegiance to any side. He revealed the limitations of human ambition and the impermanence of even the most formidable constructs of power. The Emperor, despite millennia of wisdom and foresight, recognized a profound truth, that some forces could not be controlled, only understood. The 41st millennium, already a universe of relentless conflict, had been forever altered by the silent, absolute calculus of a being unconstrained by morality, loyalty, or desire. And so the Emperor withdrew, silently acknowledging the new reality, while Dr. Manhattan continued his observation of the Imperium, the warp, and the galaxy at large. The confrontation left no casualties, no trophies, but it reshaped understanding itself. That power could exist beyond ambition, influence beyond conquest, and understanding beyond even the farthest vision of humanity. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Imperium learned, for perhaps the first time, that true mastery of the universe required more than strength. It required comprehension of a reality far greater than any mortal mind had yet conceived. Have you ever imagined a galaxy at war, where battles rage across thousands of worlds, yet the outcomes are no longer dictated by armies, weapons, or strategy, but by the quiet, inescapable will of a being beyond comprehension? Dr. Manhattan had expanded his influence, intervening across multiple war zones simultaneously, reshaping conflicts on a scale that no mortal, or immortal, could have anticipated. From the icy plains of Fenris to the blazing skies of Armageddon, entire fleets, legions, and warbands found themselves subject to changes that defied logic, probability, and expectation. What had once been chaos, strategy, and chance was now an elegant calculus of inevitability. Imperial commanders struggled to adapt. The Ultramarines, fighting off Tyranid incursions, noticed their flanks reforming mid-battle, entire Tyranid broods vanishing and reappearing elsewhere, while Ork warbands that should have overwhelmed planetary defenses were redirected almost whimsically. Even veteran space marines, trained to face the impossible and emerge victorious, were forced to question everything they had learned. Battles that had been long planned collapsed in fractions of a second, only to be resolved in ways that were both miraculous and terrifying. It was not victory or defeat that mattered now. It was understanding that survival itself had become a fluid concept under the influence of Dr. Manhattan. Chaos, predictably, grew ever more frantic. Abaddon, seeing his forces fail repeatedly in ways that no strategy could explain, became obsessed with understanding this anomaly. Every demonic incursion, every cult uprising, every scheme to destabilize the Imperium met subtle but absolute intervention. Manhattan did not destroy for malice, nor did he aid for loyalty. He simply acted, bending causality to demonstrate the fragility of all things in the 41st millennium. The dark gods themselves, accustomed to manipulation and fear, could do little but watch as a mind operating outside the warp shifted the very rules by which reality functioned. Xenos' forces, too, were not immune. Tyranid fleets found their trajectories subtly altered, redirecting entire invasions. Tau forces saw coordinated strategies dissolved before execution. Even the enigmatic Eldar experienced glimpses of outcomes they had not yet chosen. Across every sector, the galaxy was subtly rewritten. Civilizations that had faced certain annihilation were spared, only to confront new challenges that reflected Manhattan's impartial, incomprehensible logic. For those who fought and died in these wars, the presence of Dr. Manhattan transformed reality into something simultaneously protective and terrifying. A universe where their actions mattered less than the perception of one godlike observer. Amidst these events, philosophical questions emerged for humanity and beyond. If a single being could alter the outcomes of entire wars across light years, what became of heroism, leadership, or sacrifice? What meaning remained in the struggles of mortals and immortals alike? Inquisitor Vera documented these reflections, noting that the Imperium's understanding of power, causality, and fate was being reshaped in real time. Dr. Manhattan's presence challenged not just the tactics of war, but the very foundation of existence in the 41st millennium, revealing a universe where inevitability could no longer be assumed, and where the consequences of every action were subject to the subtle calculations of an entity who operated beyond good, evil, or ambition. And so the galaxy burned differently. Conflicts raged, but the rules of engagement had changed. Armies maneuvered, fleets clashed, and worlds were saved or destroyed not by courage or conquest, but by the quiet, incomprehensible will of a being whose gaze encompassed all possibilities. The Imperium, Chaos, and Xenos alike were forced to accept a reality that defied understanding, that in a universe once ruled by war, power, and ambition, one being could demonstrate that the true measure of influence lay not in force, but in comprehension, perception, and the inexorable logic of inevitability itself. What does desperation look like when the mightiest agent of chaos realizes that even his greatest schemes are powerless? Abaddon the Despoiler, Lord of the Black Legion, understood that his usual methods, demonic pacts, sorcery, and brute force, were ineffective against Dr. Manhattan. Across war-torn worlds, fleets of chaos warbands had been dismantled, entire legions frozen Midas, Alt, and demonic summoning rituals undone before completion. Abaddon's obsession grew, for the usual tools of fear, manipulation, and brute conquest no longer applied. He realized that the very foundations of chaos were being challenged by an entity entirely beyond ambition, malice, or loyalty. Desperation drove Abaddon to coordinate a massive, galaxy-spanning assault, concentrating every available force in a single, audacious gambit to trap Dr. Manhattan. Chaos fleets surged through the warp, legions of corrupted space marines and demonic legions mobilized, and entire cultist networks prepared for rituals of unprecedented scale. Yet, as the assault commenced, Manhattan's presence remained unshaken, unprovoked, and unaligned. What seemed like a trap to the galaxy was, in his perception, merely a set of probabilities unfolding, each iteration equally observable, each outcome equally inevitable. The very act of attempting to ensnare him illustrated the futility of ambition when confronted with a mind unconstrained by reality. On multiple battlefronts simultaneously, Abaddon's forces encountered the quiet perfection of Manhattan's intervention. Entire fleets disappeared and reappeared in strategic positions, not by accident but by subtle, inexorable calculation. Chaos armies attempting coordinated strikes found themselves neutralized without loss of life to Manhattan himself. Forces were rerouted, their objectives nullified, and entire conflicts resolved before the first shot could even be fired. Sorcerers and warlocks watched helplessly as spells unraveled mid-chant. Demons faltered without provocation, and the subtle imperatives of probability shifted beyond their comprehension. Abaddon's fury became his weakness. The more he sought to dominate, the more evident the futility of his power became. Dr. Manhattan did not need to fight. He needed only to exist, observe, and manipulate causality in ways that mortals and immortals alike could barely perceive. The Black Legion, despite its unmatched brutality, realized that they were participating in a war dictated not by aggression but by inevitability. Abaddon's desperation, normally a source of cunning and terror, became irrelevant against a being who saw all possible outcomes and chose which threads of reality to guide, if only subtly, toward his own inscrutable purpose. The galaxy watched in awe and terror as the ultimate agent of chaos discovered the ultimate limit, that even gods and monsters could be rendered powerless in the face of a mind unconstrained by time, morality, or desire. And yet, in this demonstration of power, there was no malice, no conquest, no domination. Dr. Manhattan's interventions highlighted the fragility of all systems of control, exposing the futility of ambition in a universe governed simultaneously by causality and indifference. Abaddon's forces retreated not in defeat, but in recognition of a reality they could not bend, manipulate, or corrupt. The Imperium, observing from afar, recognized a sobering truth. No strategy, no army, no god could compete with a being who existed beyond time and space, whose interventions were absolute, and whose understanding of consequence surpassed even the most enlightened minds. Chaos had met its match, not in battle, not in strength, but in the quiet, immutable logic of inevitability. The galaxy trembled not at violence, but at comprehension, as Abaddon's desperation illuminated the stark truth of the 41st millennium, that Dr. Manhattan's presence was not a threat in conventional terms, but a revelation, a demonstration that the universe itself could be bent and reshaped by one mind that had no allegiance, no malice, and no ambition beyond observation. What happens when a being who exists beyond time decides that his work is complete, and the universe is left to reckon with the consequences? Dr. Manhattan, having reshaped countless battles, neutralized threats across star systems, and demonstrated the futility of ambition for mortals and immortals alike, began to withdraw from the 41st millennium. His departure was not dramatic, no announcement, no warning, but its effects rippled through the galaxy. Planets once teetering on the brink of annihilation stabilized, fleets found themselves in positions that defied expectation, and soldiers who had fought without hope now confronted a reality forever altered by a mind beyond comprehension. The Imperium, for all its power and discipline, struggled to understand what had transpired. Robout Guilliman convened councils across multiple sectors, consulting with the Adeptus Mechanicus, Inquisitors, and planetary governors. Reports detailed impossible phenomena, battles resolved without casualties, entire invasions rerouted, and strategic victories achieved without human intervention. Philosophers, psychers, and scholars debated for hours over the implications, attempting to quantify the incomprehensible. Inquisitor Vara, documenting the events, noted that even the Emperor's vision of the Imperium would have to adapt to a reality in which one being had demonstrated that destiny itself could be bent, rewritten, or nullified at will. Chaos, predictably, faltered in the aftermath. Abaddon, enraged and humiliated by his inability to manipulate or confront Manhattan, retreated to the Eye of Terror, nursing both his wounds and his ego. The demonic legions, confused by the absence of intervention, sought to regain footing in a universe where the rules they had relied on no longer applied. Their dark gods, accustomed to manipulation and fear, could do little but observe as the Imperium recalibrated itself in the wake of a force that had proven them irrelevant, not through conquest, but through understanding. Across the galaxy, Xenos forces also reeled from the implications. Tyranid hive fleets, Tau incursions, and Eldar interventions were subtly disrupted or redirected, leaving civilizations to adapt to outcomes they had not anticipated. The presence of Dr. Manhattan had created a new baseline reality, one in which mortality, strategy, and ambition were no longer absolute, but contingent upon forces beyond comprehension. Even the most advanced civilizations found themselves humbled, forced to recognize the limits of their understanding in a universe that had been quietly, irrevocably altered. And yet, in all this disruption, there was clarity. Dr. Manhattan's withdrawal was not an abandonment, but a demonstration of possibility, a universe where inevitability could be observed, influence could be measured beyond ambition, and the consequences of every action were understood in a broader context. The Imperium emerged stronger in knowledge, if not in certainty. Chaos and Xenos alike were left to contemplate a new reality where power was no longer measured by armies or sorcery, but by the ability to perceive, manipulate, and comprehend the cosmos itself. The galaxy had survived, but it was forever changed, its inhabitants forever aware that the rules they had relied on were only as constant as the observer who chose to bend them. What does a universe learn when a being who exists beyond time leaves without a word, leaving only the consequences of his presence? Dr. Manhattan's departure was absolute and silent. Across the galaxy, the Imperium, Chaos, and Xenos alike paused to comprehend the subtle, irreversible changes he had wrought. Worlds once poised on the brink of annihilation had been saved, battles had been decided without human intervention, and civilizations faced futures subtly realigned by a mind unconstrained by morality, ambition, or loyalty. The 41st millennium had survived, yet it was no longer the same galaxy, and every being within it, mortal or immortal, felt the weight of this profound alteration. The Imperium, for all its structure, discipline, and reverence for the Emperor, now understood that true power could exist outside the realms of conquest and warfare. Robout Guilliman convened councils to study the long-term implications, while the Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to quantify and record the phenomena, though they knew no instrument could fully measure what had occurred. Inquisitor Vara chronicled the events with painstaking care, aware that future generations would struggle to grasp the philosophical and practical lessons of a presence that had demonstrated fragility of every assumption about war, destiny, and power in the galaxy. Chaos, meanwhile, found itself humbled. Abaddon and his legions had confronted a force greater than ambition, rage, or divine favor. The demonic pantheon, used to manipulation and worship, could do little but observe. Their schemes unraveled, their legions neutralized, and their understanding of influence challenged. Even the warp seemed quieter, as if acknowledging that one being, detached, impartial, and all-seeing, had demonstrated a scale of power they could neither contend with nor comprehend. The galaxy, in a sense, had witnessed a masterclass in inevitability, the supreme demonstration that some forces are untouchable not by might, but by understanding. Xenos civilizations felt the same subtle recalibration. Tyranid hive fleets retreated to reconsider strategies they could no longer predict. Tau campaigns faltered without clear cause, and Eldar seers glimpsed alternate timelines that no longer aligned with their foresight. Across all species, the underlying lesson was the same. The universe was vast, complex, and far more malleable than even the greatest minds had believed, and its ultimate architect, or at least its quietest observer, was beyond allegiance, morality, and comprehension. In the aftermath, the galaxy reflected on what had transpired. Dr. Manhattan had acted not out of conquest, not out of malice, nor even benevolence, but simply because he existed and could. The Imperium learned that survival required adaptation and understanding, not just faith and firepower. Chaos learned that ambition alone could falter against a mind that transcended desire. Xenos realized that even the most advanced strategies could be rendered meaningless by forces beyond time itself. And for all, there remained the lingering awareness that one being had reshaped the universe simply by observing it, leaving a legacy of inevitability, comprehension, and awe that would echo across millennia. And so the galaxy moved forward, forever changed, haunted, and enlightened by the brief but profound presence of a being beyond the understanding of gods, mortals, and monsters alike. The wars continued, the stars still burned, and life in the 41st millennium endured, but nothing, and no one, would ever see reality in quite the same way again.